Hello, my name is Naomi Speakman and I'm the co-curator of the British Museum's new exhibition, Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint. And on behalf of the British Museum, I would like to welcome you all very warmly to this event, The Construction and Destruction of a Saint, Thomas Becket, which is presented in partnership with the British Academy. This is the third of our events in the online public programme, which accompanies the Becket exhibition. And if you didn't make our previous events, these are available to view on the British Museum Events YouTube channel. And the next talk after this coming up in the programme will be on pilgrimage and its enduring power on the 10th of June. To find out more information about that, please check out the British Museum's website. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce the chair for this evening's exciting event, Dr. Emily Guerry, who is co-director at the Centre for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University of Kent. And she will introduce this evening's speakers and preside over the session. Emily, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation, Naomi. I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to express my congratulations to you and Lloyd de Beer and Sophie Kelly and the entire team at the British Museum for creating and delivering such an excellent and engaging exhibition of the life, death, and legacy of one of the most fascinating cults in history, despite the difficulties of doing so throughout lockdown. What an extraordinary achievement. It's an honor and privilege for me to chair tonight's discussion on the construction and destruction of St. Thomas Becket with two leading historians, both of whom are fellows of the British Academy. For the sake of time, I will now offer only a very brief introduction to their distinguished contributions to the arts and humanities. Diarmaid MacCulloch is Emeritus Professor of the History of the Church at the University of Oxford, and his wide-ranging and field-defining work includes books on the history of Christianity, the Reformation, as well as captivating biographies of King Henry VIII and that of a different Thomas, namely Thomas Cromwell. And he is currently writing another book on the history of sex and the church. Nicholas Vincent is Professor of Medieval History at the University of East Anglia. In addition to his pioneering studies of Magna Carta, he recently completed a magisterial edition of the charters of the Plantagenet kings and queens from Henry II to John. If reading 7 volumes on these rich charters sounds a bit daunting, last year he also wrote an engrossing biography on King John, published by Penguin, which I would highly recommend. The structure of tonight's event is as follows. In the first instance, Nick will open with an overview of the historical context surrounding the construction of the cult, charting and exploring Becket's meteoric rise to sanctity. Next, Diarmaid will retrace the violent destruction and targeted erasure of Becket's cult in the 16th century and reconsider its aftermath. Then, Nick will re-examine its reconstruction, or rather revival, in the 19th century. There will be plenty of time for further discussion afterwards. I would like to remind all attendees of this webinar to place your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. Then we will do the best we can to moderate and share them with our speakers in the conversation that follows. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Nick to begin this exciting conversation on the construction and destruction of the cult of St. Thomas Becket. Over to you, please, Nick.
Thank you very much, Emily, and good evening, everybody. I'm going really to act as the warm-up here to Diarmaid, and really I'm going to try and introduce you to Becket and to his cult. Now, medieval saints' cults, a bit like safety razors and COVID face masks, came in 2 varieties. There are the single-use ones, where there is a particular attachment to a locality. There is perhaps a particular function the saint performs. They cure warts, they break the chains of prisoners. And then there are the multi-use safety razors, face masks, and saints' cults, polyvalent, multifaceted, that reach internationally and that change often dramatically over time. And Becket falls into that second category. He became one of England's both chief symbols and chief exports. From the word go, I suppose that we can see that that was going to happen through the simple number of paradoxes and contradictions in Becket's own life. I mean, here was a Londoner, very much a Londoner, but who spent most of his life out of London. Here was a man who was no great scholar and yet made a great song and dance in Paris of showing himself as the head of learning, encouraging other scholars to work on his behalf. Here was a man who thought of himself as one of the king's principal friends, who became famously one of the king's greatest enemies. Here was a man that the king made Archbishop of Canterbury, hoping that church and state would be governed in harmony and that Becket would do what he was told, who immediately, on being made Archbishop, had this conversion experience where he became the advocate of the church against the state. Here was a man who the monks of Canterbury elected Archbishop, thinking that they were buying themselves one of the king's closest friends, and finding out immediately that they'd actually bought themselves the king's principal enemy. And we could go on with those paradoxes. And Becket later on is presented very much as a figure under the control of the papacy, but he was a thorn in the flesh of the Pope in his lifetime, Alexander III, who wanted peace with the King of England and the King of France, because they were his principal supporters in exile against his great rival, the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. The last thing Alexander wanted was this Archbishop of Canterbury stirring up problems. Now, all of that changed in Becket's death. By his death, immediately, Becket was recognized as having died for a cause. No one was quite sure what that cause was at the time, but there was no doubt that he had died in the most extraordinarily dramatic circumstances. The monks immediately, on washing his body, found that he'd worn a hair shirt. They immediately saw the potential that they had here for a miracle worker, a wonder worker within their own cathedral. And immediately, miracles began to be reported at Canterbury. You might think also, and it's often presented as such, that the king would immediately turn against the cult of Becket. But in fact, in death, Becket could now become the king's advocate in heaven, just as he was an advocate for the monks. So the king used Becket in 1172, 2 years after the murder, when he sought absolution from the Pope's legates. And he used Becket again in 1174 in the midst of a great rebellion against him. By deliberately seeking penance at Canterbury, the king used Becket to show his reconciliation with God. And although the cult then traveled widely throughout Europe, some of that transmission was by the king's critics, for example, to Paris, to the rivals of the Plantagenet kings, the Capetian kings of France. The Louvre, for example, was founded originally as a college of St. Thomas with a distinctly anti-Plantagenet, anti-English bias to it. But elsewhere, it was Henry II's daughters who carried that cult into Spain and Sicily and Northern Europe to the Baltic and beyond. So from the word go then, it is a polyvalent cult. It appeals to many people. The papacy use it, the king uses it, the kings of France use it. And looking forward then, what changes in this cult? Well, the great event came 50 years after Becket's death, in the summer of 1220. The intention initially, obviously, was that the body be removed from the crypt at Canterbury and brought up on high. And the papal canonization of Becket, which occurred very, very quickly, remarkably quickly, had already predicted this translation of the body. It was supposed to take place in 1186, but it couldn't because the monks by that stage at Canterbury were once again in dispute with their then archbishop. It was in fact delayed for a further 35 years through to 1220 and was presided over by a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who had an agenda of his own, who had a particular reading of Thomas, just as the kings of England did, just as the monks of Canterbury did. Becket's reading was that Thomas was a means to salvation. through reflection on the image of Thomas, the salvation of souls could be assured. And the salvation of souls is the principal function of the church in the eyes of Becket. And Becket's translation in 1220 was arranged by Langton as a great jamboree, deliberately timed in accordance with the predictions of the book of Leviticus for the date of a jubilee on the 10th day of the 7th month after 7 times 7 years, which happened to fall on Tuesday, the 7th of July, a Tuesday that was a lucky day in Becket's life, and was also the anniversary of the death of Becket's rival, Henry II. But into this great jamboree, Langton introduced the King of England, Henry II's grandson, Henry III, reminding people that Becket is now patron not just, as it were, of the monks of Canterbury or the archbishops or the church, but of everybody, of the realm and of the king. And thereafter, although Becket was used in political propaganda against the crown, so that we read of the canonization of opposition, the idea of Becket as a saint who stood up for the church against the state. We find that, for instance, in the 1260s, when we're told that Becket was one of the defenders of Simon de Montfort. Becket emerges from his grave to defend the cause of the rebel barons against Henry III. We see it again in the rebellion of the 1320s by Thomas of Lancaster, the cousin of Edward II. Thomas of Lancaster is seen as a new St. Thomas, using that idea of opposition to the crown. But at the same time, we find the kings of England regularly making pilgrimage to Canterbury, regularly patronizing the cult, and at the same time that Thomas of Lancaster was rebelling against Edward II, Edward II was claiming that some mysterious oil of St. Thomas, discovered in France, whereabouts at present secret, if used in the coronation of an English king, would assure that king the reconquest of his lands in France. And although Edward II didn't use that oil at his coronation, it was then conveniently rediscovered, probably by the Black Prince, and used at the coronation of the first of the Lancastrian kings in 1399, Henry IV, as a sign of the legitimacy of that new Lancastrian line. So this is a polyvalent, multi-use cult that is reused and reused again, that is reinvented perpetually over time through the days of Chaucer, through the days of Henry IV and the Black Prince, both of them buried, of course, in front of the shrine, through to the days that we're now going to hear about, where things turn rather more peculiar. And for that, I'm going to hand you over to Dermot, who's going to tell us what happened next.
Thanks, Nick. What a splendid place to take up the story. You've emphasized just how multivalent, you called it, multi-shaped this cult is. And there's a dimension of the cult which really interests me. We think of Thomas as Thomas of Canterbury, and that's where the shrine was. But as you also told us, he's Thomas of London. He's born in London. And in London, at the place of his birth, right in the center of the city, is a church, St. Thomas A'Can. And this is not under the control of the monks of Canterbury. It's an independent cult center run by secular clergy, not monks, which may be one reason why it found itself in dire financial trouble around 1500, after quite a lot of trouble over the years. And at this moment, it was saved by one of the principal London guilds, the Guild of Mercers, who'd had offices and things in the precincts of St. Thomas A'Can, but now they made it their chapel, the Mercers' Chapel. And so everything was set fair for the cult of St. Thomas in London. And all of us know Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and we think of that story beginning in the Tabard in Southwark. I don't think it did really. I think most of the pilgrims will have started in the center of the city at St. Thomas's A'Can, and Chaucer chooses not to say that. So this is a cult with a center in the greatest city of the realm, as well as that rather remote place for most English people, Canterbury. That's where we were at the beginning of the 16th century. It was still very much part of the establishment of the monarchy. As you've emphasized, Nick, the monarchy had found a complex way of dealing with Thomas. And so in 1529, 1531, as Henry VIII's affairs were getting a little complicated in relation to Rome, a chaplain of the king took a routine offering to the shrine. Still, it's there in the royal accounts. The second time, actually, by the brother of one Anne Boleyn, who was now the king's mistress. What an irony that was. He took the money up to the shrine in Canterbury. But still, St. Thomas was okay. You can tell that by a letter written to Thomas Cromwell, no less, by Prior Goldwell of Canterbury Cathedral Priory in 1532, when he hopes that God and St. Thomas will reward Thomas Cromwell for his goodness to the prior. So it's still a very acceptable compliment to pay in 1532. And yet there is already the sign of trouble, because the early reformers, who in the 1520s were still not part of the king's circle, were evolving a new story of the English church, a story of cheating, deceit, usurping royal power. William Tyndale, the great biblical translator, was the man who masterminded this new narrative of Thomas the traitor. Now, the king might listen to that. Tyndale was writing in 1531, and the king was increasingly at odds with the hierarchy of the church, who would not give him what he wanted, a declaration that he'd never really been married to Catherine of Aragon. And not surprising they wouldn't, because it wasn't true. But in this conflict, the king might listen to Tyndale for the first time, and others might too. And the conflict between the church and the monarchy hotted up during 1531-2. The Archbishop of Canterbury, no less, the aged William Wareham, wrote a speech which he probably never delivered in the House of Lords, but he intended to deliver it, and death struck him down before he could. And in this speech, he brought up the name of Becket. He quoted Becket's late 12th century Life by Herbert of Bosham. He gave examples of kings who died miserably for attacking the church. Perhaps just as well the king did not hear that. But what he did hear by 1534 was the imperial ambassador scolding him for his attack on the church, his now completed break with the Pope in Rome. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, in an ill-tempered interview with the king, said he should take example by King Henry II, who, though one of the most triumphant kings of England, underwent a grievous public penance by command of the apostolic legate, besides promising to go to the Holy Land because of his lack of reverence for St. Thomas of Canterbury. He'd encouraged his murderers. This is the imperial ambassador. This is not really very diplomatic talk. And you can imagine the effect on Henry VIII. Things began changing, therefore, in the first years of the 1530s. And that would draw the king's attention to all sorts of inconveniences in the royal story. If he had gone to St. Thomas A'Con in the middle of his capital city, he would see stained glass windows which depicted a naked Henry II being scourged by clerics. This was not the message he would wish to convey to his loyal subjects at this time. And there's another element to this story which I think has been ignored and is really very important. And that's the popular image of Thomas, Thomas of London, Thomas of Canterbury, but Thomas also defender of the poor, not just defender of the church, but a man who had stood out against unjust royal exactions against the poor, principally royal taxation. I began noticing this story in the late 15th century, when there was a tax rebellion in the north of England in 1489, a really serious one, where they actually the population lynched the Earl of Northumberland, who was then trying to raise a royal tax. And an account of this rebellion in Norfolk at the time said that these lynchers, these enemies of the king, had gone about to destroy our sovereign lord, the king, and the commons of England for such unlawful points as St. Thomas of Canterbury died for. And I thought, what on earth is going on here? Well, this was a tax rebellion. It was about tax, as the Earl of Northumberland found to its cost. So that stuck in my mind. And then I went on into the story I was researching in the life of Thomas Cromwell. And in Cromwell's papers, there was an account of a row in Oxfordshire. And it was a row between a pardoner of St. Thomas of Canterbury, who was, of course, selling indulgences, and a loyal subject of the king. They had a row about the fact that St. Thomas of Canterbury died for 52 points concerning the Commonwealth, which 52, your said orator, this is not the partner, the other guy, your said orator denied and said that the 52 points were a dance called Robin Hood. Isn't that significant? So he's mocking the pardoner, but he's also saying that the pardoner's message is that of a thief, the thief in the greenwood, Robin Hood. So clearly by the late 15th century, there was a narrative told by pardoners selling indulgences of St. Thomas of Canterbury that St. Thomas had a whole list of points which people liked because they were attacks on royal power. Think how this would play with King Henry VIII. And yet another letter in Thomas Cromwell's papers in 1535, an evangelical clergyman wandered into that church in London, St. Thomas Aiken, and was shocked by the windows. But he also said that as he'd gone around the country, he'd heard pardoners of St. Thomas in declaration of the pardon of St. Thomas, talking about divers points wherefore he was slain, in which he did resist the king. One is that he would not grant that whosoever set his child to the king would not grant that whosoever set his child to school should pay a tribute. So this legend that monarchs had stopped people getting education, or they'd have to pay for it, that was something Thomas resisted. And these are what they call Articles of St. Thomas. Now, this is hugely significant. It means that St. Thomas was not just seen as the enemy of the king because of his defense of the privileges of the church, but resistance to royal taxation. In the decade when Thomas Cromwell was actually creating new ways of taxing the people. So you can see why Cromwell should be against the king. And the end was therefore almost inevitable. From 1537, a concerted attack on the cult of St. Thomas, led by the current Archbishop of Canterbury, his successor, Thomas Cranmer, who ostentatiously in 1537 did not fast on St. Thomas even, presumably had a slap-up meal when he should have been fasting in a very ostentatious evangelical way. And this was the beginning of the end. In 1538, the shrine, as we all know, was dismantled, bizarrely just after a tourist visit by a great French lady who was coming down from Scotland, where her mistress had been queen and died. So she was going home to France. But on her way, honored guest of the king, she was taken to Canterbury Cathedral to have a look round. And everyone was watching. And this French lady, very much up to date in her fashions, though maybe a good Catholic in her own eyes, decided not to give reverence to St. Thomas when the monks offered his jeweled shrine to her. Very interesting. And a few days later, the king's servants destroyed the shrine. It's quite possible that as part of this very stagey drama of dismantling Thomas's cult, a play was performed, an anti-Becket play in Canterbury before the king by Cromwell's tame playwright, John Bale, who was producing a whole flood of evangelical drama at this time. So by the end of 1538, Thomas Becket had gone. He was out of the church's calendar, that's the list of saints, he'd gone. And for even conservative courtiers, Catholic-minded courtiers, this was a good thing. because they saw Thomas's attack on the king's rights, and perhaps this one on taxation, as a proof that Thomas was a bad man. And so there's a joke in a letter to Lady Lisle at Calais by one of her servants about the destruction of the shrine. And yet Lady Lisle was quite offensively conservative Catholic. So it's not just Protestants here, it's those who feel themselves loyal to the king, particularly courtiers. Now, what happened to St. Thomas at this moment? His shrine was dismantled, we know that. All the jewels went up to London. What about the body? The story straight away was that it was burned. And it's very interesting that it's not just angry Catholics in mainland Europe who thought that. It was approving Protestants. We have letters to the reformers in Zurich who are watching this situation in England with great interest. Ah, yes, and Thomas's body burned. Hurrah, good thing. But we don't get that from the government. In early 1539, Thomas Cromwell put together what he intended to be a sort of statement of where the Reformation had got to. It's very circumspect. It may have been designed for the German ambassadors, the Protestant German ambassadors to read. It never got sent out. But one of the things it said was, no, Thomas's body wasn't burned. It was put in what a crossed out passage says, he was buried in a noble tower. And I've no idea what that meant, but it was clearly a significant detail. And the whole text has a sort of ring of authenticity, though it is, one has to say, propaganda. He does say there was a second head of St. Thomas at Canterbury Cathedral, which was burned. And you can see the sort of Protestant point being made. This is a man with two heads, and one of them got burned. But the proper body wasn't buried. Now, I think that's probably right in that as shrines were taken down, even after the time of Thomas Cromwell, for instance, at Worcester, the shrine of St. Wulstan, the bodies were reburied discreetly. They weren't treated with scorn because these were human beings. They weren't silly relics of girdles of Our Lady, that sort of thing, which you should burn, or statues of Our Lady of Walsingham burned. But this was a man, and it might be considered not good form to burn a body like this. So the jury in my mind is out on this. But one fact on the other side seems to me that no one in Mary's reign, when Catholicism came back, tried to reassemble the shrine with Becket in it. And you think someone might have known. But again, Thomas Cromwell's 1539 document suggests possible reason for that, in that he says Thomas Becket's bones were mixed up with those of others. So it might have been seen as simply impossible to recreate an authentic St. Thomas in a shrine. So the question is deliciously open, but I incline towards thinking burial rather than anything else. So we've destroyed Becket. We've destroyed him with the enthusiastic approval of his successor as Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who, as the shrine was demolished, had his own personal seals as Archbishop re-engraved to replace any mention of Becket. And what did he put in his place? As a good Protestant, he put the crucifixion. So from a saint to the person who really will give you salvation, Jesus Christ on the cross. And we have books from Cranmer's library in which he or his secretary have conscientiously erased the name of Becket, very much as the king would have approved. So what happened next? What happened, for instance, to St. Thomas Aiken, the Mercer's Chapel? Well, the king very generously gave them the chapel. It was still a college of secular clergy, but they got it. And now it was the Mercer's Chapel. And the leadership of the Mercer's Chapel were, by and large, mates of Thomas Cromwell. They are Protestants. So now the Mercer's Chapel, far from being the center of a cult, would be the center of progressive preaching. And as time went on in the reign of Elizabeth, it was notorious as a place where Puritan clergy were preaching the message. and Thomas Becket was now utterly discredited. He did creep back into the Protestant Church of England's calendar. That's its list of saints' days published in 1553. You needed St. Thomas for practical reasons, because you needed dates to look at legal documents, and you might find a deed from your granddad which mentions St. Thomas, so you needed to know which day that was. However, he appears in the calendar as Becket traitor. A strange way to use the ecclesiastical calendar, but there it was. And once more, Thomas Becket was in play in the reign of Mary, only the next year, 1554. Now the Mercers had to put the statue of Thomas Becket up on their Mercers Chapel, and it was pulled down by some malefactor, some vandal, overnight, more than once during Mary's reign. There were a lot of Protestants in London who loathed the return of Becket. And one little after story to all this, another successor to Thomas Becket and Thomas Cranmer was the Archbishop of Canterbury in Charles I's reign, William Laud, who likewise died a violent death on the scaffold in 1645. And I was very interested to read his biography, which is here. This is Peter Heylyn's Cyprianus Anglicus. That's a description of William Laud. And he incorporates that speech that William Laud made on the scaffold in the Tower of London in 1645, his chance to sort of present himself as another archbishop, a martyr, hence that name Cyprian that Peter Heylyn had chosen. Now, William Laud in this speech name-checked various predecessors who had also suffered violent deaths. And he did go for medieval archbishops who'd suffered violent deaths before him. The Anglo-Saxon Alfrich, but even more surprisingly, Simon Sudbury, who'd had his head cut off by the peasants in the Peasants' Revolt. He didn't name-check Thomas Becket, and that's partly because his speech emphasized how Protestant William Laud was against the Protestants who are now executing him. But neither did he mention Thomas Cranmer. Isn't that odd? A Protestant archbishop who did not actually name-check his most illustrious Protestant martyr predecessor. Something was changing in the Church of England, changing in the way that English history was being written. And I think Nick may have some thoughts about those changes in relation to Becket.
Thank you very much, Diarmaid. And fascinating. I think some of the keys you've already supplied to what happened afterwards. So this reinvention of Thomas. And the first of those keys is Chaucer, because Chaucer, as we all know, was actually a good Protestant. Long before Luther, Chaucer is celebrating a view of the church where the pardoner is a bad man and the good parson is a good man. And whatever Englishmen could do with Becket, they could get rid of Becket from their memory. They couldn't rid themselves of the Canterbury Tales. So in those collections of British worthies, who are the great men in English history, you will invariably have Sir Walter Raleigh and John Milton and Geoffrey Chaucer. So the idea of Canterbury as a site of pilgrimage, and with that, the idea of Becket survives. And then also there is, as you say, that change in tone in the Church of England, this recognition that increasingly Becket is not seen as monkery and popery and the red rag of Rome, but as something rather more fundamental to national identity. Now, as late as the 1760s, Lord Lyttelton, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, famed for being unable to add up. I don't suppose he's the last Chancellor of the Exchequer who couldn't actually do simple maths, but that's his chief claim to fame as Chancellor. But he wrote a biography of Henry II in which he presented Becket as a traitor, as a hypocrite, as someone ungrateful to a very good master. But thereafter, the Gordon riots, problems in Ireland, the emergence of a high church party keen to separate church and state, even within the Anglican establishment, and this re-emergence of the idea of Becket as the protector of the poor, which Diarmaid has already referred to, all of those play both into Catholic and to Anglican sensibilities. So, for instance, we find Catholic historians like John Lidgard at the beginning of the 19th century presenting Becket now as a hero rather than as a hypocrite. We find Catholic churches after emancipation increasingly dedicated to St. Thomas. We find within the Anglican establishment that high churchmen like Harold Froude and Froude's chief friend, John Henry Newman, see Becket in many senses as a hero, a man who defends the church against the state, as they're trying to do. And 1833, Newman's first visit to Rome was choreographed by Harold Froude, his friend, as an opportunity for Harold Froude to seek out relics and remains, above all manuscripts, of St. Thomas, whose letters Harold Froude was translating. And the first meeting between John Henry Newman and what was to become the head of the English Catholic Church, Cardinal Wiseman, took place in the Venerable English College in Rome in 1833, around the memory of St. Thomas. And the Venerabile, the English college for the training of English Catholic priests in Rome, is absolutely stuffed full of remains of Thomas, of images of Thomas as the martyred English Catholic Church. In that same framework, we find Daniel O'Connor, Ireland's liberator. What did Henry II do after the death of Thomas? Well, Henry II went into Ireland and conquered Ireland as a symbol of his willingness to obey the Pope, his true Christianity. Well, O'Connell manipulates Becket as an image of the martyred Ireland. Just as Becket was killed by Henry II, so was Ireland by that conquest of 1171. And in 1840, Daniel O'Connell, the new Becket in the eyes of some of his supporters, Ireland's liberator, bought an enormous canvas showing the martyrdom of St. Thomas that's still on display in Dublin in the church at St. Andrew, Westland Row, just over the road from the Protestant centre at Trinity College. Now, I'm not going to take that story on and on, but you find, for example, within the Oxford movement, Cardinal Manning and Gladstone both first visited the English College in Rome on the feast day of St. Thomas, the 29th of December. Manning in 1838 on his way towards Rome, towards conversion to Rome. And within the Anglican Church, although, as Diarmaid very neatly points out there, Becket traitor was in the 16th century prayer book, the inclusion or non-inclusion of Becket within the liturgical year remained a subject of dispute through to the 1920s and that prayer book dispute of 1927. Within the Anglican Church, the only newly consecrated Anglican church dedicated to Becket was a church at Teignmouth in Devon, consecrated in 1898 by the Bishop of Zanzibar for the Central African mission of the universities. You can see in a world where English missionaries, Anglican missionaries are going out to die for the faith, that Becket once again is reinvented as a protector of those who die defending the liberties of the church. You can see that right the way through to the present day. So, for instance, if you cross the road from Canterbury Cathedral, just over the road from the cathedral precinct is the Roman Catholic Church of St. Thomas, and there they have relics not only of St. Thomas Becket, but of Oscar Romero, the Bishop of San Salvador, who was shot down within his own cathedral, a Becket for our own days, as recently as the 1980s. Now, what I hope we've shown there, the two of us, is this constant reinvention of Thomas over time, the controversy over Thomas, the paradoxes of Thomas, the contradictions within his own career. And perhaps now it's time for me to hand over to Emily, who I think is going to try to explore some of that through some questions and maybe some answers. Emily, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much, Diarmaid. It's been a fascinating discussion of the construction, destruction, and reconstruction of the cult of Thomas Becket. And we have wonderful questions coming in from the chat. So thank you to our attendees too. I'd like to open up with 2 questions from our audience, but then I'd also like to give our speakers an opportunity to ask questions amongst to one another too. And hopefully we can get through as much of this as possible. I wonder if I could please begin with you, Nick. We've got a question here about the relationship between Becket and Henry. You said it was close before his appointment as Chancellor, but do you think they were really friends? What would you say about the friendship or notion of friendship between Becket and Henry II?
So we all know, Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, we all know that Henry II and Becket were the best of friends. But actually the biographers of Becket really make it plain that that was a very strange relationship. The king constantly taunting Becket with the reminiscence of the fact that Becket was low-born. Becket clearly thought that Henry II was his best friend and that this friendship would in due course be restored, and continued to hope that that was going to happen all the way through, more or less to the eve of his death. But I don't think the king saw it in those terms at all. We're talking one of those friendships, you know, I don't know, people who imagine that Prince Charles is their best friend, or people who imagine that they are particularly close to some very grand figure. The grand figure themselves don't necessarily see it in that same light.
Yes, that's extremely helpful, and that sounds more correct. And I now have a kind of similar-ish question for you, Diarmaid, about the nature of people's relationships to Becket, but this is about other people called Thomas. So I've tried to combine 2 questions here. So to you, Diarmaid, due to his name, wouldn't have Thomas Cromwell grown up with an interest in Thomas Becket, who was presumably his namesake? And is there any evidence for Cromwell's interest in Becket as a younger man? And then here's the second part of this, a similar question. To hear that Thomas Cranmer in 1537 had a feast instead of fasting, and then assisted with the destruction of the cult, especially in his role as Archbishop of Canterbury, did he ever express an interest in Becket before he helped to ruin the cult? So the 2 Thomases.
Very interesting. And the name Thomas, they were all called Thomas. Everybody was called Thomas, and that is a mark of Becket's impact in England, because this is not the case elsewhere. It's a very English phenomenon. And actually, there is another Thomas to take into consideration, Thomas Wolsey, who was the old master of Thomas Cromwell. That's where Cromwell's public career had begun. And Cromwell adored Wolsey. This has been forgotten, and it's a bit paradoxical. He's the architect of the Reformation, but he adored Wolsey to the extent that he copied his coat of arms and turned it into a version of his own coat of arms, which is a tribute to the Cardinal, to Cardinal Wolsey. Now, Wolsey's coat of arms had been constructed in a very careful way to show his loyalty to the king. So it's got a red rose, but also it has 2 little blackbirds, choughs, Cornish choughs. And another name for chough is Becket. So Wolsey had put 2 Cornish choughs, Beckets, on his arms, and so did Thomas Cromwell. When he matriculated, registered these arms in 1532 after the Cardinal's death, this is a really conscious tribute to, not to Becket, but to Wolsey, at a moment when Wolsey was in disgrace and dead, a non-person. Anne Boleyn must have been furious when she saw this coat of arms. It's a deliberate slight to the up-and-coming next queen. And Cromwell and
I think we've just lost the connection from you, Diarmaid. I'll wait just another moment. But I had no idea about that story of the choughs and Becket. I think I'm just going to pause to hope Diarmaid comes back. But in the meantime, Nick, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Well, actually, I can come in there too, because
yes,
there's another Thomas that Diarmaid didn't mention, of course, which is Thomas More. So we get in the 16th century a chap called Thomas Stapleton, another Thomas, Jesuit at Douai, writes a book called The Three Thomases, the Tres Thomae, that takes Thomas the Apostle and Thomas Becket and Thomas More, all as great symbols of the Catholic establishment in England. So as Dermot said, and I too am waiting to see whether Dermot returns. Is he there? Are you there, Dermot?
He's not here now, but I'm sure we will hope for him to come back momentarily into the Zoom. But I wonder, Nick, in the meantime, I've got a slightly different question to you, and this is about Becket oil and the use of this oil in royal ceremonies. And this question asks, is this similar to Becket water, i.e. the water mixed by the monks at Canterbury Christ Church to create with the kind of flecks of blood? Was this a sort of relic, and was it kept in Canterbury and guarded there, or in Westminster, where the other royal things were?
That is very interesting. It's at Westminster. It's used for the coronation. So it isn't the same as the water. The water, in theory, has particles of Becket's blood in it, and if you drink it, it will cure you of whatever, sin or disease. But the oil is used for sacring the king at the coronation. And the only occasion where we know for certain that it was used was the coronation of Henry IV in 1399, which was an extremely controversial event. Obviously, he deposed his predecessor. But presumably, it then survived at Westminster through to the Reformation. It's listed in inventories in the 15th century. The model for it isn't Becket's water. It's the holy oil that was used for the consecration of the kings of France, the Saint-Ampoule, that descended from heaven to Clovis for the baptism of Clovis in the 6th century, and that was kept at Rheims, and used thereafter for the coronation of all French kings through to Charles X in 1830 or 1828, whenever Charles X was sacred.
Yes, that's right. It sounds very similar to the sort of Saint-Remy phenomenon indeed. And I still don't see Dermot, but I still have a lot of questions for you, Nick. And this one I find very interesting indeed. And I think I'm, again, combining a number of questions we received. The person asks, you've mentioned that nobody knew exactly what cause Becket had died for at the beginning. So what kind of options were there? It seems very obvious in retrospect, but what did different people say at the time about the motivation for his death and the reasons for his death?
Well, to some, it was a friendship gone horribly sour. So to some, it was a personal dispute. To others, it was a dispute about the Pope and the extent to which the English Church and the Church of Rome were in relation to one another. To others, it was a question of jurisdiction. Should the priesthood be under the jurisdiction of the state? If they themselves committed a crime, would they be tried by the church or by the state? To others, it was a question of salvation. So Becket was a model of a holy life. He was a good pastor who had died for his flock. He died protecting his own supporters. So it's his head that's damaged, and he dies defending even his cross-bearer, Edward Grim, who has his arm very badly injured. And incidentally, that I think must be the two heads of Thomas, because the relic of the corona, the relic of the bit of his skull that was knocked off by the sword stroke at the time of his martyrdom, that was indeed kept in a different place in Canterbury from the main part of his body and skull.
Yeah.
For all of those reasons, there are any number of causes for which he might have been said to die. And then, of course, you've got those, even in his own lifetime and after, who say he's a hypocrite. He dies really as a histrionic actor, acting out the part. All of this conversion is a false conversion. There are those, even in his own time, who doubt his true sanctity.
Yes, that's very much the case, isn't it? And thank you again, Nick, for fielding all these questions as a sort of single force at the moment while we wait for Dermot to return to us. But you're doing a fantastic job. And if you don't mind, I have yet another excellent question from our audience. Does the international appeal of Becket reflect the strength and power of England at that time, or was there something more particular and less political?
It's a very interesting question, which I hadn't really thought of before. England's importance, well, England is important, yes, and diplomatically and militarily, yes, it does really, that awful phrase they continue to use today, punch above its weight in international affairs. So part of it is that. And also the uses to which that is put. So for instance, Dover Castle, the White Cliffs of Dover, you think of the castle there, even in the Vera Lynn incarnation, the castle is there on the White Cliffs. Well, that castle is built by Henry II, really for the reception of high status visitors, the King of France, the future Pope, Innocent III, went to Canterbury in the 1190s, probably. Large numbers of foreign pilgrims using Dover as their point of entry. That castle is itself a symbol of the king rebuilding his own affairs to broadcast a particular view of England to the world at large.
Yes, thank you for that, Nick, and welcome back, Diarmaid, too. I've just seen you rejoin the Zoom. We're so pleased to see you here. You've missed some very exciting discussion from Nick, but I just want to give you an opportunity to finish what you were saying before about the three Thomases, if you'd like to come back on your earlier response.
I wonder where I froze. I'm on another laptop now.
Okay.
I was saying that Thomas Cromwell had taken his arms from Thomas Wolsey. Thomas Cranmer, of course, didn't come into this equation. Cranmer's central theological principle was the fact that Henry VIII was supreme head of the church. He got there, I think, by realizing that, but by deciding that the Pope was a fraud. So someone had to step into the gap, and it was the king. And in the narrative, which he was adopting from the likes of William Tyndale, what Thomas Becket's role must be is Becket traitor. And that's why there is such a consistent line from Thomas Cranmer on this matter. So he and Thomas Cromwell were coming at it from different directions. I think with Cromwell, it was probably much more the taxation points which I drew your attention to. But with Cranmer, it's the question of the king.
Thank you for that. And I wonder if I can quickly come back there with another question for you, Diarmaid, but I'd love to hear from your point of view too, Nick, with this question, because it combines a lot of our audience questions as well. I had no idea that there was a text that claimed that Becket's body was buried in a noble tower. If you had to guess, where would this be? And if I can add another question first to you, Diarmaid, and then to you, Nick, what became of Becket's body, in your expert opinion?
It's really difficult to say that this phrase, which is crossed out, as it is indeed amongst other of that sort, that's bodies, other of that sort, conveyed and buried in a noble tower. What's that mean? It suggests that various saints have been brought together in some way, but I find it baffling. I really don't understand it. But what it does suggest is that some saints have been deliberately mixed up together, rather as happened in Oxford with the bones of St. Friedeswide, who was mixed up with the wife of a prominent Protestant reformer. So really, I don't know if Nick's got any ideas, but what could this noble tower be? It's a really odd phrase.
You've got all the great East works at Canterbury, which are all those towers that were built in the 1170s. The thing I immediately thought of was entouré, and whether it's actually just some sort of feeble pun in French, that entowered and interred are rather similar words. And then, of course, you've got this whole excavation in the 19th century. So there is a claim in the 19th century that they do indeed dig up Becket's bones. And much is made of it, but obviously the Anglican establishment, still being Protestant, very keen to play that down, not wanting really relics. A blind boy from Margate cured by touching the relics. Jesuits from London turning up to watch over what's going on. And all of this is, as it were, if not hushed up, but sort of gently put to rest in a very Anglican way. So it's still an open question today. Where are these bones?
And one I think we will continue to debate. We've got time for just one more question. And again, I'd like to offer it to both of you. And it's a lovely one from people who are tourists visiting Canterbury this week. They say, seeing the altar, icon and candle placed prominently in the cathedral, we were wondering if the cult might be considered very much alive today. What do you, the panelists, think of that?
Well, I think I'll jump in. I think the answer is yes. The Church of England has rediscovered the importance of sacred place, and very many great churches in the Church of England now have reconstructed shrines, and St Albans has two, and Dorchester has another, and these are really popular. Canterbury have handled it in a different way with this sort of eloquent empty space, which I also like. But yeah, it's very much back, and it's back very consciously in a building, particularly in Canterbury, which is very conscious of its Benedictine past and has very warm links with Benedictine monks throughout, just as Westminster Abbey does these days.
Yes, and just like Westminster, you've got those magnificent tombs, the Black Prince, you've got Henry IV up there, and you can get on YouTube, there was supposed to be an enormous jamboree, 7th of July 2020, there was going to be an enormous set of ceremonies in the cathedral. But you can see on YouTube this very, very toned down evensong service with one sole celebrant all alone in that great East End of Canterbury Cathedral, entirely devoted to Thomas, but that with just a single candle burning on that great pavement where the shrine stood. And it's actually rather moving. So yes, as a space, and also, of course, as now an essential part, not just of the history of England, but the history of Europe, of the European Church in the Middle Ages. This is one of the great stories. It's up there with St. Francis. Becket has more biographies, more contemporaries write about Becket, record what happened on that day of his death, than any other medieval saint.
I find that a really beautiful place to close our conversation. And on behalf of everyone in attendance, thank you so much, Diarmaid and Nick, for an illuminating conversation about, again, the construction, the kind of destruction, ruination, and then the revival of Becket's cult. We've all learned so much, and we've really enjoyed listening to you. It's been a fascinating discussion. And on that last note, I'd like to encourage all of our attendees to please try to consider making a visit to Canterbury Cathedral in the near future. And of course, the British Museum to see the marvelous exhibition. Thank you to the British Museum and the British Academy for organizing this event. And if you can't see the exhibition, the very least you could do is pick up the beautiful book co-authored by Lloyd de Beer and Naomi Speakman, Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint. You can get it online. But once again, thank you both so much for an excellent conversation. And for those of you around the world in the audience, please join me in a virtual applause. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.